was fantastic. You know, it was a phenomenal crowd here. I just enjoyed walking around talking to everybody. I just talked to somebody who was at our first space flight in June of '04. Is there anybody else here who was out there for that? Come on. You're kidding.
Every flight.
Wow. Well, let me get a little bit of intel on that. I started a development of home-built airplanes a long time ago. I flew my first one. In fact, you're going to see videos of the very first flight testing of the Very Vegan, which was done when I was working for Jim Beatty in Kansas in '72. But since then, there's actually been 42 airplane types flown that I've had the privilege to be the designer, and to work with a phenomenal group of folk who are a hell of a lot more talent than I was when I was their age. So it's just cool watching them work. And there's several of them here. In fact, you guys are working for Scaled. Come on, we've got a few. Is that all? We only have like 6? Okay, that's good. But anyway, I want to tell you something about that flight, and that's really my best memory of everything that we've done is that event, because it was very special. All of these airplanes are generally, whenever we're doing a flight test, certainly a first flight, whenever we're doing anything that's envelope expansion, we always do it very quietly. And that is because if something real bad happens, then you never find out about it, right? But anyway, that day, the June the 21st of '04, was the first time that we actually invited the media and the public to an envelope expansion flight test. That was the very first time, and the only time. You know, the X Prize flights, they weren't envelope expansion. We were just doing the same thing with a heavier ship. So that was a very special thing. My sponsor was intent on having the media there and having the VIPs there, but was not interested in having the public there. And I really felt that this is a special occasion, that if commercial spaceflight goes like it possibly can, it would really be cool if little kids could come there and watch this flight and be able to tell their grandchildren that, hey, they saw the first commercial manned space flight, and they were actually there. You know, like people that were there in Le Bourget when Lindbergh flew across. You know, that was a big thing for them. So anyway, we invested in that and got the security and the toilets and the parking all set up and whatever, and we invited the public in. Now, I didn't even know about it, but there was a rich guy down in Lancaster, Palmdale, that went to Los Angeles, and he leased 44 big buses, and he brought school children there from 2 schools so they could be there. And that was really cool. I mean, the reason I mentioned that is there's all these kids around here. That was very, very important to me to be able to kind of have someone there for something that was expected to be historic. And hopefully, if there is commercial space transportation in the future, I'm talking about non-government stuff for people to fly, that they'll look back on that and say, hey, I was there, and that was cool. Okay, this talk, I really haven't decided what to say. I wanted to kind of look at your eyes and let you kind of give me feedback. So give me some feedback during this next half an hour, and we'll see how it goes. And I'll try to give as much time as I can for Q&A too. But what I've done here is I've dug out a bunch of old pictures, and we also dug out a bunch of old videos. The videos you're going to see were taken by 8mm cameras, okay? Back in the 50s, we we had 8mm movie cameras. Well, they'd only take about a minute of video, or excuse me, of film. Footage. Buggy whip, film, same thing, right? But sometime in the 80s, I got those out, and before they totally fell apart, and I shined them on a wall, and I set up a video camera, and I made VHS copies of them just by pointing the camera at the wall. And so I gave my big stack of VHS videos to my daughter-in-law about 6 years ago, and she digitized all of them. She finally got it all done, and as a Christmas present, she gave me 28 DVDs. So I have all of this stuff on DVDs now, and so I've kind of had a little fun pulling clips out of it. So it's something that I just put together in the last few days, and we're gonna have some fun showing it to you. The oldest picture I could find of me flying a real model airplane was, I think this is a flight streak. I'm not sure. When I was 12. I tended to go in to do weird stuff. I mean, I did build a flight streak, and everybody had a flight streak. But I also built a 9-foot span control line endurance model, okay? And it had about 2 gallons of fuel, okay, on 70-foot lines. And I was going to set a record that could never be beaten on control line endurance. Well, the thing that I found out was that it didn't have much to do with the model. It had to do with the endurance of the guy that's standing here doing this, you know. And, you know, well, actually, I'm right-handed with everything except flying control line models. I'm left-handed. And the reason is, when I started, I couldn't afford those $12 motors, so I just sling them. And if you sling this way, you can't see it. But if you sling this way, you can't. So I taught myself to fly control line with the left hand. And I was unable to find a model, a picture of me hovering, but in those days there were 2 big meets. One was the AMA stuff and the Nationals, and they were held all over the place. The closest one was Los Alamitos, which I went to in 1959. Later on, I went to Dallas in 1960, and I'd love to tell you some now. If I have time, I'll tell you some more stories about that. But the things that we had that happened about every other weekend were what was called Western Associated Modelers, or the Wham meets. Anybody remember the Wham meets up in the San Francisco Bay Area? You do, okay. Pop Robbins or whatever that organized that. They're all control line, and they're every kind of control line. And they had different rules for control line carrier. AMA had the rules that you get a point for every mile an hour on your first 7 laps from the time you take off from the carrier. And then you go into low speed and you give some kind of signal that says, I'm flying low speed now. And then they measure how many miles an hour you fly on low speed, and you get a point or some points for the difference between your low speed and your high speed. Okay? Well, Wham had different rules. They gave you a point for every mile an hour on high speed, and they gave you a point for every second that it took you to fly 7 laps on low speed. Okay? It sounded about the same, but still everybody was putting nitro and 60s and trying to get more high-speed points. And I showed up with this Grumman Guardian, and I wish I had the film of it here. I couldn't find it. So I showed up with this Grumman Guardian, and I'm just roaring around at some real mediocre speed. Nobody paid any attention to that. I mean, this kid's got a 35. He's not going to win. But I had 2 handles, and I had a bell crank under the horizontal tail, so I could pull it around to get line tension, and then I could work the throttle this way and the elevator this way, and I could hover it. Now, a year before, some guy did figure eights over in one corner and you know, to make more time for 7 laps, and they said, oh, that's illegal. So they made a rule that says you must always be progressing around the circle. That was a constraint we were under. But I brought it around and I brought it into the wind, and inadvertently I stopped and I was disqualified. So I'm sitting here not moving forward, and the carrier is over here and I'm disqualified. So I backed it up, brought it down over the carrier, hooked a wire and put it down, and everybody was kind of scratching their heads. What's going on here, you know? So anyway, the next flight, I garnered several hundred points by flying this thing at a real slow speed, hovering it, and I beat everyone by the biggest margin that they'd ever seen, you know. So that year, because they couldn't change the rules during the year, I won all of the control line carrier stuff. And then they outlawed me for the next year. But anyway, let me go. This is also a control line endurance model, this other one when I was 13, but the big one was, let me just continue on here. Okay, the Wham contests. I went to them from age 13 to 16 up in the Bay Area. I'm a little kid with a flat top over here. A local guy in our small hobby store used to drive us up there, and we'd leave about 3 in the morning, so we'd drive up to San Francisco for these meets and come back that same day. My dad was a dentist, and he and a doctor and a farmer went out and bought a Bonanza in 1953. And so I ended up doing a control line scale model, painted up and built like my dad's Bonanza, entered it in the 59 Nats, and I think possibly the 60 Nats also. If I can find the cursor, here we go with again, this is 8mm stuff, so we're not going to find sound, of the Bonanza in control line scale, 57 when I was 14 years old. And my trophy, of course, you know, get away. Good-looking kid, you know, I was 14, of course. Okay, now this is control line carrier, and again, I wish I had the hovering stuff on here, but I don't. This again was age 14. I'm up doing a control line carrier at a Wham meet in the Bay Area. This was before I figured out hovering the model. This is when we just kind of slowed it down with flaps and whatever. And so I'm only flying with one control hand, with one hand left, and you can see I'm drinking there too. I haven't figured out what the hell it was I was drinking, but okay. The first big presence that I had at the Nats was at Dallas in 1960. I entered just a handful of events in 59, but when I was 17, I was off to the Nats with 9 different events. And I tell you, my memories as growing up, the most phenomenal memories was being out there in those hangars at that Naval Air Facility, and where guys were in there all night getting their models prepared for competition next year. I had come from a little town with a tiny little hobby store, and that was my whole exposure. And all of a sudden, I'm at the Nationals, and I'm at a hangar as big as this, and there are just lines of tables and guys getting ready for competition, the next one, which is really cool. Now, I did the Nordic tow line gliders. There's an A1 and A2 there. And that was in the days when we'd use, for dethermalizers, we'd soak this cotton in saltpeter, and you light it off, and it burns real slow, and then it burns through the rubber band, and it flips the tail up. And somebody cornered me after Spaceship One and said, "Burt, you did that. That's the same as dethermalizing a Nordic glider." And you know, I didn't think of it. But maybe the inspiration is there, but it was subconscious, the inspiration to do the feathered reentry. And it was very much the same thing, and you'll see that a little later. But control line stunt, the F-27 I flew that for a couple of years in control line scale. And the Guardian that I hovered is actually in this picture down at the bottom. It's actually in a configuration after they outlawed me. So I wasn't able to use the bell crank under the tail. Okay. Oh, this is a little bit about the F-27 at the 59 Nats, and just some old cool pictures. Oh, this is the demise of the F-27. I'm in control line scale. I've got my own circle, 70-foot lines, and the next circle over is a group that's launching a jet speed. Remember the Dynajet speed? Do they still do that? Yes. Okay. I'm surprised. I was wanting to bring a Dynajet into this demo room over here and just let these new guys know what real airplanes sound like. But anyway, I didn't see it because I was just lifting off in my F-27 for control line scale, and this kid had got this Dynajet started and launched it, and you know, when your Dynajet goes around, it goes around real fast. And if it hits you, it'll probably kill you. I mean, it's going, I don't know, well, they were going a couple 100 miles an hour. And he backed into my circle. And I caught him with the outboard engine, right there. And, you know, I never did find out what happened to him. They hauled him off to the hospital. I hope he's okay. He's not here, is he? But anyway, that's how I lost the F-27. I didn't rebuild it after that. Okay, my very first Canard design was a radio control model that I did while I was in college. And this happened just after the A11, which became the SR-71. A11 was unveiled. And, you know, this is kind of a corny joke, but, you know, it says FX 935 on it. You know, that the first A11 was FX 934, and it's kind of silly, I know. But anyway, I figured that a front engine, by blowing on the Canard, would provide a big pitch change, and I didn't want that. So I put an engine on the back mounted high so it would pitch it down. So if you bring both engines up, it may not have this big pitch trim change. But anyway, I flew that at college, and then I decided that I'd develop a wind tunnel so I could develop a home-built airplane. You know, I was thinking about the Varivigan at the time. So I built my own home-built wind tunnel, which is shown on the right there. Okay, this is something that I did really weird that would be thought of as nothing nowadays, but fast forward, we're 1965 now. I'm at Edwards. My first big project was a stability and control flight test engineer on the XC-142A. Anybody familiar with the 142? Yeah, not many, right? I know. Okay, it had 4 turboprop engines, cross-shafted, and it also had a gearbox going back to a tail propeller. Okay, in hover, this thing would lift up, and the tail propeller, they'd change the pitch on it for pitch control, and they'd change the pitch on the outboard engines for roll control, and they'd wiggle the ailerons for yaw control. Okay, and by the way, a long time, decades later, they developed something called the V-22 in the age of computers and CAD and sophisticated aero design. Well, the guys who are familiar with the 142 are proud to say this was done in the 60s with pencils and French curves and slide rules. This airplane, compared to a V-22, has a bigger cabin, a larger payload. It has a cruise speed of 100 knots faster than the V-22, and it had almost twice the range of a V-22. Duh. And, you know, we didn't have control augmentation in those days. It just had a yaw damper. But this thing with no control augmentation had level 2 flying qualities in hover. It's a neat airplane. I can't find a picture of the model, but I built a model of that in 1965 that was radio controlled. Well, we figured this thing going to be too hard to fly. You know, in those days, there was only a handful of people that were flying RC helicopters. And we're going to build a tilt-wing, hovering, transport RC model. I mean, that was a big deal in those days. By the way, the model was about, I don't know, 7-8 foot span, fuselage kind of like this. I put an engine on the back, no cross shafting. In those days, nobody had a variable pitch propeller for model airplanes. We just had wooden props. So I had 60s on the inboards, 35s on the outboards, and 19 in the tail. And I ran the tail engine full blast all the time, creating lift so it would pitch it down. And then make it pitch up, I made a set of louvers that would close under the prop so it would turn the thrust upward to pitch it up. So all I'm working is these louvers, but I'm running the tail motor at full blast. And then we had one guy, keep in mind this before proportional, we're doing this kind of flipping stuff. I saw my transmitter over in a booth over here. It's that 10-channel CG, the blue box. So we had one guy who's in charge of thrust of the inboards, which is hover height. He also had pitch, and he could run the wing tilt up and down. The other guy flew nothing but roll and yaw. Now, I don't know if you've tried this, but it actually works pretty good if you beforehand decide what maneuvers you're going to do. But how many have flown a radio control model that has two pilots with one guy flying two axis and the other guy flying the other two axis? You don't do that, huh? We thought it was a cool idea, but anyway. We did hover it. We never did transition it. We ended up rekitting it a couple times and gave up. Okay, I went to a little higher Reynolds number to get some more data on this home-built airplane I was building and build a car-top wind tunnel. Did this in '67. We'd usually go out at night when the winds were down, and we found out that Dart station wagon actually was a different car than this. I just set this up for the picture. And we could get it up to about 85 or 90 and with this rig on the top. And what we're doing with this is we're using radio control to move the rudders and the ailerons and the elevators. And the model is sitting on a spherical bearing, just a big rod end. So it would trim to an angle of attack. It would trim to a side slip. And I had springs on roll so that I could measure by how much it moved what the roll moment is, but I let it trim to a side slip angle and to an elevate and to an angle of attack just directly, and I could move that ball bearing forward and aft for different CGs. And it provided the aerodynamic data that gave me confidence to go out and build my own home-built airplane of this weird configuration. And you know, I look back on that now and it says, you did what? That was it, guys. I had no CFD to speak of. I had, you know, just hand calculations on lift and drag and so on. And this little guy racing down the road gave me enough confidence that I could build this airplane and have my own little fighter airplane. Weird. The fabrication methods, again, I didn't find a booth here selling balsa wood, which I think is a damn shame. You guys still build with balsa wood? Yeah, I do. Yeah. I mean, all these things that are prefab, I mean, how's kid going to learn to build something new if he doesn't buy balsa wood? Okay. How many here remember the cost of a 36-inch by 3-inch by 1/16 inch piece of balsa wood? That's the most popular size we'd buy, right? How much did it cost? 16 cents. But anyway, I built the Varivigan kind of like we built balsa wood models, except I used Sitka spruce and birch plywood and glued it and stapled it all together. There's this new thing that came in that was really a good way to attach wood to itself. It's called epoxy. and so, you know, that was a big deal. I built it out. I built it out of epoxy. Okay, now I'd finished the Very Vegan and got it almost ready to fly in 1971. Okay, it wasn't painted yet, and my boss sent me to St. Louis, and I was there for 4 or 5 months. I was there to do the flight test planning for the stability and control flight test of the F-15 fighter. Okay, right in the middle of the Vietnam War, this was this real far out new generation fighter, and I had to go to St. Louis, TDY, for 4 or 5 months. Okay, and I was going to stay there until almost the time at which the F-15 was ready to make its first flight. Well, I did 2 real interesting things while I was there at TDY in St. Louis. One, I met this gorgeous girl who was a computer programmer who's working at McDonnell Douglas in flight test, and she had a couple of kids, and I married her. Okay. The other interesting thing I did while I was there on that trip is I decided that I ought to build a radio control model of this airplane that I had back home being painted and just see how it flew radio control. I only had this wind tunnel data on it. That'd be a good thing to learn. If this thing was safe to fly, I'd build an RC model. Now, in those days, I hadn't flown RC since the early 60s when we had just this beep beep stuff, not proportional. Okay? So I bought this stuff, and I just went out and found a local hobbyist who was a good RC pilot. And I said, you're going to fly this thing so we can do some flight tests. All right? Now, keep in mind, I had already built this airplane. Okay? And I had it ready to fly. And I was going to, as soon as I get home back to Edwards in Lancaster, I'm going to make the first flight on this home-built airplane. So now, let's see how the RC model flies. It had a 60 in it. I'm not explaining all the reasons, but the thing wouldn't rotate, and when it did, it would die. Whoa, it did a snap roll. And my new wife is thinking, you're going to fly this? Okay, there it is. Yeah, not a real good flight. Okay, finally, we got it off the ground. Okay. And, you know, once it was up and away, it flew pretty good, but I crashed it about 6 times trying to get it airborne. Oh, there's Carolyn. Yeah. And then I found, well, the big problem was a bouncy runway with the grass, so we hand-launched it. Whoa! It would usually hit the ground after you did that, but I showed the successful one in here. But anyway, here is now I finally have confidence maybe this thing won't kill me after all. Here's a triple aileron roll. It was a big deal in those days. And I didn't get a picture of the crash, but I am going to show you the last flight of the Very Vegan RC model. Here it goes. Yep, that's it. Yeah, okay. Okay, now, a few months later, I was getting ready to fly this airplane, and I ended up taking a job and quitting my Air Force job and going to Kansas. So I put this airplane in a moving van. The outer wing panels came out and stacked my furniture and belongings around it, and off it went to Kansas. Now I'm in Kansas, and I'm ready to fly the Very Vegan for the first time. What you're going to see here is all of the initial testing of the Very Vegan, the initial taxi test and everything. I just kind of had a box around the engine. I didn't build a cowling yet. There's nose wheel liftoff. Good. Unlike the model airplane, it does rotate. That was good news. Here, I put just a little bit of air under the tires, and here's a runway flight. Good. Doesn't look like it'll kill me. I'll go ahead and set it down and then do a real flight. And there I am. I flew it until it was almost dark. Gear up. And a landing. So anyway, that was kind of cool. Now, I did this on a Sunday. Oh, this was later. And here I am celebrating the fact I'm still alive. Yeah. Yeah. I was working for Jim Beatty, which in those days was a company with about 35 or 40 people, and we were flight testing this little airplane called the BD-5, and he had promised to deliver all these kits to, I don't know, 10,000 people and whatever. There were only a couple guys out there when I flew this flight that you saw, the very big one. So Monday, I came to work, and I announced to everybody that, man, I build up confidence now. I'm going to fly the first flight of the very big one. I'd already flown it, but I didn't tell anybody. I wish I had video of this. But anyway, I took off. And I flew it erratic as hell at first. I did a bunch of these and whatever. And, you know, they're all thinking, oh, Rutan's about ready to buy the farm. You know. But it was just a joke. Yeah, I know. Anyway, there I am in the BD-5. I was the second guy after Les Bourbon to fly the BD-5. I had principal design responsibility for just two things when I was at Beatty. I wasn't the designer of the BD-5 or the BD-6 or the BD-4, but I was a flight test director, and I ran the team that was developing it, but I wasn't the airplane designer. I had two design jobs that were mine. One was the jet version of the BD-5, and you see that up in the right, and you may have seen it in some Bond movies, and they still do air shows with it. And the other thing was an idea that worked a lot better than it deserved to. It's called the truck-a-plane, or we called it truck-a-plane. Beatty called it the Beatty trainer. What we did is it took a BD-5, a real BD-5, and stripped it down, took the motor and not the landing gear, but just took everything out of it. It had a landing gear, basic airframe, pilot, made it as light as we could, and we went in and found the center of gravity of it, and we put a big rod in, very much like this wind tunnel model, okay? And then we built some structure going back to a truck. See the truck behind? Okay? Now, that rod end, it wasn't just in place where the airplane had to lift it. The rod end had an upward force of a couple or 300 pounds. And we did that by making a fulcrum and putting garage door springs. I think you can see them on the right here, if I can find the cursor. Up here are some a whole row of garage door springs. So if this airplane was on the ground, it would only weigh, 50 or 75 pounds. Now you get in it, it's heavier, right? But it's much lighter than a BD-5, which means it has a lower stall speed. Okay? But if you climb, the springs relax, and if you get up high, the stall speed's it's not going to have this lift coming in through the rod end. So now it has a higher stall speed. And the cool thing about it is you can fly it high and do a stall, and you're cushioned by these springs so you don't end up busting the landing gear. Now, you can bust the landing gear real easy on a BD-5. I don't know if you've flown one, but anyway, so we had something that people could learn to fly on. Now, the truck driver, all he did is there were stops on it if you went left and right. All he did was steer to keep you right in the middle, right in the front. And originally, he was the throttle, and the guy in the airplane would call for more power. What we did is we put a push-pull thing so that the throttle on the BD-5 ran the carburetor on the truck. Now, you could sit there and peel rubber from the BD-5 throttle. That was really cool. And you could take off, and then you could slow down to hold your speed. and you could pull off power and you could land. And you can't see the truck at all. The thing that was different as the truck ran over tar strips is you had this kind of a lunging thing, you know. It was nice and soft this way, but fore and aft you feel it kind of like, so it was kind of like you're in turbulence, but kind of a little bit of a jar to the turbulence. But it was the greatest trainer in the world because we had a single-place airplane and there was no two-place version of it. So everybody is going to have zero time and type when he first flies it. So the idea is that he flies in the trainer, and it worked a lot better than we thought. You go out and do crosswind landings in it, for example, which is a tough thing to do on a gusty day, and it teaches you exactly the right thing to do. But you're flying an airplane that is the full-scale airplane. You're sitting in it, okay? And the stall speed is slower, though. Now, we were going to take it down the freeway, but we'd be worried about the guy in the airplane trying to go over the overpass, so we didn't do that. Okay, RAF, the Rutan Aircraft Factory. Talk a little bit about the model airplanes of RAF. These aren't model airplanes. They had a birthday party when I was 50, so a bunch of guys showed up for that. Okay, we did a full-scale model for deep stall testing of the Long Easy. So here we got a model on a truck, on a balance, so we could measure its lift and drag and pitching moment. To this day, my wife Carolyn was the only pin-up model that's been on the cover of Sport Aviation. That's kind of a Bible Belt sort of an organization. So there was a lot of flack when they ran that cover in 73, I think it was. Okay, NASA was interested in these things too. They did some wind tunnel testing. The pictures on the lower right here are radio control models. I went ahead and put out plans for the RC model of the Very Big one. And not a very good flying RC model, but it was something I could make another nickel and a dime for. How many have seen the movie Death Race 2000? Okay. They got a hold of, remember Paul Mantz? Paul Mantz died shooting the movie Flight of the Phoenix. When it landed, the thing fell in, broke the fuselage, and he was killed. But Tallman was still around, and this movie production outfit got with Tallman and said, we need a futuristic airplane for this year 2000, Death Race 2000. We're talking 1974 here. So they're looking way in the future to the year 2000, and they need a futuristic airplane. So he came over to my place and said, I want to rent your airplane, son. And I said, you do? He says, well, I've got to fly it. And he said, oh no, I'm Frank Tallman. I'm the stunt pilot. And I looked at him, and he had a wooden leg. And the Very Big one was real touchy on the rudder pedals. And I said, listen, I don't just let anybody fly it. I mean, it kind of offended him, I guess, but I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So anyway, a month later, Tallman went to Europe for some other reason, and the movie producers went around him and gave me a call, and they said, hey, can you do it? We'll let you fly it. And I says, you bet. So I quoted him $750, and that was wet. I had to buy all the gas and everything. So we did some interesting stuff, and if you've seen the movie, near the end of the movie, you can see the stuff where we're buzzing the cars and bombing them. And I'm going to show you some of the film here from it. It does have a radio control model on the end, because the Very Big one crashes into a mountain and explodes and burns, and I refuse to do that part of it. So they did a movie for that. So a model for that. So here we go, Death Race 2000. Simeon Griffith. Okay, here's some of the passes. I took off and landed on this little road near Red Rock Canyon. So I'm supposed to buzz the car. It was a really fun flight. Now look real carefully. I'm down on the deck, and they got a camera in the back of this truck. And it's really cool when the truck's doing about 60 and you're only doing about 75, so you only gaining on them by 15 miles an hour. It's really fun. Okay, here's where I fly up a blind canyon and crash, and here's the model that they built, and they slid it down a wire, and then they'd blow it up. Yeah, normal kind of explosion you'd have when you got 10 gallons of gasoline, right? Okay, talk a little bit. I'll tell you, Dan Craig got to show you a whole lot more than I've got on scaled model airplanes. I guess you showed a lot of that stuff, right? We had to take out about 90% of what he was planning on showing you. But so anyway, he showed you a little bit, right? I've got just a couple of other things, and there may even be some overlap, but I've got a little section here called the models of scale. This is a land shark when we had a tail stall problem with the, did you cover this, Dan? We had a tail stall problem with the horizontal tail on Spaceship One. We were able to, because this thing flies up above 50,000 feet, the Reynolds number is really low. So we're able to build this part of the airplane, put it out in front of a truck, and measure real close to the full-scale Reynolds number. So this is a good wind tunnel model, and we use that to develop some fixes to fix the tail stall problem. A lot of people have seen, if you've seen Black Sky, you see this glide model. I'll go ahead and run them here. This is Spaceship One being thrown off of a tower in the glide configuration. By the way, these are not radio controlled. They're just free flight. Okay, the more important thing we wanted to find out, though, was what happens in the feathered configuration. So the idea is, when I was at Edwards in the 60s, Mike Adams lost his life during re-entry on the X-15 when he had some instrumentation problems. He got the side slip out of whack during re-entry. It departed, it spun, and it broke up, and he lost his life. I was close to that. I knew him. I mean, he worked right over there. And so that really, when I looked at this problem of, hey, can we have something that flies the public in space? I wanted a generic solution to that. You know, the shuttle has to fly the angle of attack and the side slip within just a handful of degrees during the whole reentry. They spend 20, 30 minutes decelerating, and they've got to hold that perfectly, or they're going to break up, just like they did over Dallas or Texas. I wanted something that could re-enter the atmosphere at any attitude, any angle of attack and side slip, and also any flight path angle. The X-15 had to re-enter at 40 degrees from the horizontal flight path angle. If it went steeper than that, it gets too much Q and would break up. So I made as a goal for what I did on Spaceship One, and we're sticking to that on Spaceship Two, that you can survive re-entry at any flight path angle. In other words, you re-enter the atmosphere straight in, and you're okay. Also, that you can re-enter at any angle of attack or side slip, and you're still going to be okay. Now, a lot of people say, hey, that's crazy. Well, then again, hey, if you have attitude control problems in space, you don't want to die that day. So I wanted a configuration that would glide nicely and land like a normal glider. You know, I don't like parachutes. And also, that configuration, you could throw it at the atmosphere in any attitude, and it would straighten itself out and decelerate all the way through to low subsonic speeds without the pilot controlling it. Now, you've seen the movies. The pilot just roughly aligns it for reentry. He doesn't have to. Okay? He can re-enter sideways or upside down. It will align itself. He gets a wilder ride. But anyway, he's not flying it until he unfeathers. When I say not flying it, he can go full stick, and it only changes the angle of attack from 62 to 64 degrees. Okay? I mean, it's locked in at that high angle of attack. he can use full rudder, and it doesn't change the side slip hardly at all. He can use rudder or aileron to point in a different direction during reentry. In other words, to rotate around the velocity vector like this. But in terms of side slip or angle of attack, he's not flying the airplane during reentry. And here's what it looks like. We're going to throw this thing off the tower just in a random way, and you'll see it straighten right out. The streamer is so we can measure the angle of attack. Boy. Okay, I did about 6 different configurations of the reentry configuration. All of them worked, but they're all subsonic. When we got into studying it with CFD and running the computer at supersonic speeds, because all the reentry deceleration is done supersonic, we found out that only one of them really worked. 5 of them did not work, only 1 worked for a supersonic reentry. So we didn't qualify it based on these tower drop models. This was just something to kind of get a feel for what seemed to work. But we proved it in the computer because the reentry is all done supersonic. The X-15 goes through maximum Q way down at 65,000 feet, maximum indicated speed. Okay, think of it as putting a bullet into the atmosphere. SpaceShipOne, even though we fly higher than an X-15, we flew a couple miles higher than them, it has maximum Q up at 105 or 110,000 feet, okay? And its Q is only 7% of what an X-15 is. Enormous difference. But anyway, that's a little bit of the model part of the development. Okay, Dano I think showed this yesterday, but I'm going to show it again. When we introduced White Knight 2, people see this thing flying around without a spaceship on it, and for some people's minds, it looks like this thing is going to break in the middle. Actually, the wing is pretty strong, but there's no fuselage there. And somebody says, man, isn't that going to like break in the middle? And they say, well, anyway, I got to thinking about that, and I says, well, what if it did? You're going to lose half the airplane because there's no pilots on one side, right? But I reasoned that you could fly half the airplane home and land it. So Dano, just for, I don't know, I didn't ask you to do it. You did it just for fun. He built half of a White Knight 2 and flew it, and here it is. And, of course, success here is that you can get on ground without killing somebody. By the way, the model's over here in his booth. And sure enough, it flies okay. You don't see a lot of asymmetric birds. I don't know why. It's just that they never evolved, you know. Okay, I'm going to leave this picture up. It's the best place to store an old airplane and open it up to Q&A.